Hi, today we're going to talk about ingredients and the basic ingredients that you would be using in various breads that we'll be making in this series. As you remember, we have made a bread that had just flour, water, salt, and yeast. We also made a baguette that has a pre-ferment, and we've gone through a little bit of the baker's percentage as well as to how these things are created. But today we need to explain a little bit about what the ingredients are. That is obviously the four major ingredients of flour, water, salt, and yeast. But then also there are additional ingredients that we may be using in enriched breads. There would be things like milk and sugar, eggs, fats and such. So we'll get into those as we get into this. And all it's going to be is just a brief overview of these and part of the purpose and function that these ingredients play in a dough system. Okay? So the major component of breads obviously is flour, and flour can be multiple varieties of flour from whole wheats, rye, that could be spelt, kamut, those types of things as well. But the majority of what we're going to be doing is just a basic white bread flour. And if we were to kind of break that down a little bit, the major components of any flour is going to be its starch and its protein, okay? And then we're also going to talk a little bit about what's called an ash content. And that is going to be how we're going to be able to make a distinction between different grades of flour and different levels of flour. All right, so just in a basic overview of white flours, all right, we would talk about, let's say, high gluten flour. High gluten flour's majority is that going to be on, like say, doing pan breads, high, industrial baking, as well as like bagel making in a lot of respects. Then there's also bread flour, which is what obviously we will be doing the majority with, all-purpose flours, pastry flours, and cake flours. Now, what it is there's kind of like a descending amount of protein that is in each one of those, and that's the distinction that is between it, as well as we mentioned, ash content. But on a high gluten flour, you can have about 13 to 15% protein. That's how the miller is going to decide where that is as far as high gluten. Bread flours are generally about 11.5% protein. All-purpose, about 10%, maybe a little bit more, a little bit less, right in that range for all-purpose. And then you get down to the pastry and cake flours, which are going to be a little bit more tender because they're going to have less of the protein, which is about 8 to 9%, and then about 8% on cake. So on protein, as you know, there's a descending level. Well, it's very similar to ash content. And ash content is basically after the milling process, there is a residual amount of the overall bran. The bran is the outer shell of the wheat grain. When that is milled and then left in the overall flour, there's going to be a certain content of ash, and that ash is basically it's a number that references a percentage of minerals that's left in the flour. Okay, so when you start looking at higher ash content flours versus lower ash content flours, it's going to be like your difference between, say, a whole wheat flour to a bread flour to a cake flour. Okay, so it's again going to be kind of in a descending order. So what we want to do is talk, let's say again, just on bread flours, you've got high gluten flour at about 0.62 to 0.775, right in that range. Bread flour is about 0.52 to 0.55. All-purpose is just about the same, but a little bit lower, so around 0.50. And then pastry and cake are going to be less than 0.5. All right. In relationship to it all, if you were to put all of the bran back into the flour, that is going to be a whole wheat flour. And that whole wheat flour is going to be about 1.2. All right, so you can see how there's going to be that difference, and you've seen it when you look at the flour itself, the darkness of the color and the actual granules that are left in it. All right, that is how you can reference the ash content. So beyond just wheat flours, or what we are basically used to now for the general wheat purposes, there are the ancient grains, and there are an ancient strain of wheats that are available as well. Such as spelt, kamut, einkorn, emmer. These are the wheat varieties, but they're ancient. They haven't been, let's say, modified by agriculture. But when you use those, we will use those, some of these are going to have a little different, let's say, protein and ash content, and its overall functionality in the breads. So they have to be treated a little bit differently, as well as just the grains that we can put into breads, which would be things like millet and barley, oats, teff, buckwheat, quinoa. Those are going to be things that you've seen in the grocery stores, and they're very popular at the moment to be putting into multigrain breads, or just even making other products from those specifically. All right. So after we talk about wheat and the flours and the different grains that you can use, when you're talking about breads, the second major component is water. Okay, that is the filler, what helps to kind of link all of the ingredients together. It's what hydrates the flour. It's what basically starts the entire fermentation process and all the chemical and physical reactions. It also helps to regulate or at least establish the dough consistency, and it does establish much of the dough temperature, right? So when we do talk about the water, what we need to think about is the amount that's going to go into a dough, all right? So if it's on the higher percentage side, 70 plus, it's going to be much looser consistency. Obviously, if you reduce the water, it's going to be a stiffer dough and a tighter consistency. And its overall function in the dough is going to help to kind of generate either a faster or slower fermentation as well. Water is basically it's the kickstarter to the whole thing. You know, if you only have your dry ingredients and then you haven't added the water yet, nothing basically is going to happen. All right. There is where you still want to try to keep your salt and your yeast separate, but as long as that is and they're in the dry mix. But once you add the water immediately starts to fill the starch. It starts to develop the gluten, which is when water and protein come together. Those are the elastic qualities, the extensibility, the elasticity that we talk about on breads. So water has such an important effect on this overall bread making process. Absolutely essential, obviously, and it's just what it is. So basically, I always say it's like go time. As soon as you add water, be ready, because the rest of it's just going to happen no matter what, whether you're ready or not, right? So after we have flour, we have water. Obviously, we need yeast. Okay, yeast can be in the form of commercial yeast, or it can be in the form of a sourdough or a culture, which we will do on other episodes, and we will be making many breads with natural yeast. But if you were just to use commercial yeast, which is what the majority of breads are made from, we're going to be talking about basically crumbled yeast that they get into bakeries, large-scale bakeries, or cream yeast that comes in big trucks to make the massive amounts of bread that's at the grocery stores. But then we also have compressed yeast, which is kind of a moist block of yeast, generally comes in 1 pound blocks. That's at the majority of the small bakeries. And you can sometimes find it at grocery stores, cool grocery stores at least. And then we've also got active, dry, and then instant yeast. Okay, instant, most of what you will find in the grocery store in those little packets, they're generally around 7 to 10 grams each. That is what we're going to be making a lot of our, let's say, commercially yeasted breads with. And yeast, obviously, its contribution to bread is the fermentation. Okay, without the yeast, there is no fermentation, whether it comes from the culture, whether it comes from the commercial yeast. It's obviously known, but it does, the important thing to know about it is that it produces the gas, okay, so the filling up of the bread itself, the rising of it. It also is the production of the alcohol, okay, so the smells and the aromas, okay. It also produces acidity. Okay, and that acidity is going to be something that we can control between temperatures and between hydrations and between pre-ferments and such. So that's where we can start to manipulate what it is and how we want to ferment things. But yeast being absolutely essential to this, and instant yeast is going to be majority what we'll be using on commercially yeasted products, and then sourdoughs, cultures, we will get into a further explanation about. So now we come to salt. Salt obviously is a component that is going to add flavor to the bread, and it's As we've mentioned, it's generally at about a 2% amount. 1.8 to 2.2 is the majority of the ranges you'll have. But salt plays not only a flavor component, but it's actually essential to the regulation of the fermentation, as well as kind of managing and having an effect on its dough characteristics, okay? If you were to not have salt in a dough, you will see that the dough looks like it kind of has a sheen to it, and it also looks extremely slack. Okay, well what the salt is actually doing is that it's helping to bind all those ingredients together, and it's trying to help it stay in one cohesive thing. It's hygroscopic, so it's absorbing water to itself. And what it wants to do is, as I said, between the starch and the protein and everything else that's involved, it is keeping those bound together. The regulation of the fermentation is actually what its main contribution is beyond the dough consistency. It helps to slow down a lot of the chemical reactions that are happening in the dough system, and it helps to basically keep a pace as to how the yeast is and how the fermentation is. If you were to not have salt in a dough, you would not only see it slack and loose, but you'd also see the yeast just kind of going extremely fast and unmanageable, right? Those things are absolutely essential. So between the four components, you have to have all four components to even at least make a basic bread. Okay, so now we've gone through the four major components and what are essential to making bread, a little bit about how they interact with each other, a little bit of their function and their importance to making just a simple basic dough. But as you know, we are going to go through, and as you would know, there's additional ingredients that will be coming into making other varieties of breads. That is going to be things like sugar, milk, eggs, fats, which would include butters, shortenings, and things. And then inclusions. Inclusions are just added ingredients that come after a dough, which could be like fruits and nuts, maybe seeds, maybe little bits of chocolate and such. But each of them has, yet again, another function and a reaction to what a dough system is. And you're going to wonder why those are like that. And so we'll just go through a brief explanation as to what those are. All right, sugars. Sugars add, obviously, the sweetness, okay, so the flavor profile that's going to be the contributor. It obviously is going to affect fermentation because the yeast feeds on sugars, natural sugars and sugars that it's digesting through the flour. But if you're actually giving it direct sugar in a, let's say, a smaller dose, about 5% or so, it's going to help to increase or speed up the fermentation. If you were to go beyond a certain amount at about maybe 10% and beyond, it'll actually start to slow down fermentation. So there's a range that it is an accelerator and a range that it's a decelerator. So we have to be careful when we're doing that. That also incorporates a way to add the ingredient to a dough system and then also its physical characteristics, because the sugar is going to help to actually kind of prevent the gluten to form. And so if you were to add too much of it too fast, it'll, in a sense, break your dough. But also, if you do incorporate it properly, what it is going to do is keep kind of a shorter gluten strand, and it's going to give it that, what we call a plasticity, or something that is a little bit more like almost like a Play-Doh feel. And that's the result of the sugars itself. And then obviously in its baking characteristics, you have to be very thoughtful about a lower, longer temperature, because it's going to brown up much faster, and it's going to create a different kind of texture overall to the baked good. So it's just a few things to keep in mind. So we also have fats, and fats, there's generally about 4 or 5 kinds, but butter, margarine, different oils, and shortenings. The majority of the breads we'll be using will either use butter, and some breads may actually, we would put oils in. But fat overall, fat has a tremendous attribute to a dough and a dough system. It first of all helps to kind of tenderize the product. It adds a moistness and a richness to it, and definitely adds a beautiful flavor overall. But in certain percentages, okay, on a very low side, it's very easy to incorporate in the beginning of a dough. But if it starts to get up higher, 10% again and higher, maybe you can be on up to like 20%, you're going to have to add the addition of that fat into the dough system at a certain rate in the mixing process. But we'll go through that when we go through some of the enriched breads, but it is something to be aware of. Beyond its contribution of flavor and tenderizing and kind of that richness, it's also going to be an effect on the baking, because we do realize it's going to add a quicker browning effect. And we also need to make sure that because of how rich it is, that we're able to bake through that dough. So the majority of those things will be baked at a lower, longer temperature. Right, now we have eggs. Eggs, again, is going to be a major contributor to a kind of a texture and mouthfeel. It actually is also going to be a part of the dough hydration. So we will give a little consideration as to how many eggs and its, let's say, moisture or viscosity contribution. It's going to change the texture of the final product significantly, better mouthfeel, a little bit softer. And then it's overall, it's an emulsifying property. So when it is going into the dough system, it's again going to be added at different stages, and the incorporation is going to be essential as to how we do it. But what it is as an emulsifier in the mixing process, it's going to help to kind of bind all of the ingredients together. It's yet again one more thing that we have to be aware of on baking, because it does contribute to a faster color, and then it's also moistness and how we have to kind of go a longer, lower temperature to fully bake a product that has eggs in it. Now we have milk. Milk obviously is going to be a hydrator. Okay, so it's going to add to the overall water content or the moisture content to a dough. It is going to also be a contributor to a different color and texture, and obviously it's going to have a nice rich flavor. But as with all of these, between the sugar, egg, butter, and milks, these are all contributors to a change in the dough system from a lean dough, which is just flour, water, salt, yeast, to an enriched dough. Okay, the enrichment being these contributors. They change the texture, they change the mouthfeel, they change the baking properties, and the overall kind of dough feel. Okay, so just like the rest, milk has to be thought of in a different way, and has to be baked in a different way. Generally, that longer, lower temperature. Now, finally, we have the inclusions, and inclusions are going to be just an additional, let's say, flavor profile that is going to be either as a comparable flavor or a contrasting flavor to your dough, just depending on what you're after when you make it. But it would be things like, say, dried fruits, nuts, seeds, possibly like bits of chocolate or bits of sweet items that could go in there as well. Now, each of those has, again, a different approach as to how we're going to add this. Generally, you're going to make your entire dough system, create the dough fully, and then add the inclusion at a slow kind of incorporation stage, right? But then when we talk about each of these, we want to make sure that how we handle the seeds or handle the nuts in particular, that we're not going to be damaging it in the mixing, or that we're not missing a step. Like I would always be toasting the seeds and the nuts prior to going in, but then you have to cool the seeds and or nuts before you incorporate it as well, because it'll change the dough temperature. But each of those has the ability to break through the dough development and the dough structure. So that's again why we give a little bit better consideration is, first of all, how much, and then also how we incorporate it into the dough. But all of these ingredients, you've got your lean ingredients, flour, water, salt, yeast, and then you've got your enriching or additive parts with the inclusions. They each make and create a wonderful dough. Well, thank you for watching. I hope you have a little bit better understanding of the ingredients that are involved in bread making, a little bit better understanding of the functionality. And now in this fifth part of our series, we've been able to show kind of the basics of what we have in utensils, then just the simplicity of making a dough, starting up with a pre-ferment on the baguettes, then a little bit in baker's percent. So now with ingredients, it's a good foundation to be able to, understand where we're going to be going next. So I hope you enjoy these videos, and I hope you continue to watch them, because the really fun stuff's going to be coming up. And I hope you subscribe to this channel, as well as all of these videos are posted in a link on our kingdombread-tampa.com. Thank you so much.